Right now, millions of people are losing their grip on reality, and they have no idea it's happening. Mass psychosis doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly, disguised as safety, as morality, as common sense. And by the time you recognize it, you might already be part of it. History has seen this before. The witch trials, the rise of totalitarian regimes, entire populations turning against neighbors, friends, family, convinced they were doing the right thing. But here's what most people don't understand. Mass psychosis follows a predictable pattern. 5 exact stages. 5 stages that repeat throughout history with terrifying precision. And once you learn to see them, you'll start recognizing them everywhere. In history, in current events, maybe even in your own behavior. The question isn't whether mass psychosis can happen again. The question is whether it's happening right now. Let's break down each stage. Flooding with fear. The first stage is deceptively simple. Flood the population with fear. Not just any fear, sustained, relentless, inescapable fear. Fear that follows you into your home, into your dreams, into every conversation. The psychologist Just Mirlu, who studied totalitarian regimes, called this menticide, the killing of the mind. Constant fear and tension can break the spirit better than any physical torture. Here's what happens neurologically. When you're in a constant state of fear, your prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part of your brain, begins to shut down. Your amygdala, the fear center, takes over. You become reactive instead of reflective. Critical thinking becomes almost impossible. You felt this yourself. Think about a time you were genuinely terrified. Could you think clearly? Could you analyze the situation logically? Or did you just react? Now imagine that state sustained for weeks, months, years. Fear literally kills rational thought. This is why every authoritarian movement in history begins the same way, with a threat, a disease, an enemy, an economic collapse, something that keeps you afraid, and afraid people don't think. They obey. But fear alone isn't enough to create mass psychosis. It needs a second ingredient: reality confusion. Once fear has destabilized the rational mind, stage 2 begins, the systematic destruction of shared reality. This is achieved through one weapon: contradiction. You're told one thing today and the opposite tomorrow. Both are presented with absolute certainty. Experts disagree violently. Information changes by the hour. George Orwell described this in 1984 as doublethink. The ability to hold 2 contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both of them. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. But this isn't just fiction. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively. When people are bombarded with contradictory information, something called cognitive overload occurs. The mind, exhausted from trying to reconcile the irreconcilable, eventually gives up trying to determine what's true. And here's the terrifying part. Once you stop trusting your own judgment, you become dependent on external authorities to tell you what reality is. You outsource your perception to whoever speaks with the most confidence. This is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and Maoist China. The population wasn't stupid. They were psychologically overwhelmed until they couldn't distinguish propaganda from truth. If this concept is making you question what you believe and why, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the depths of the human psyche with me, because what comes next is even more disturbing. Isolation tactics. Stage 3 attacks something fundamental to human sanity: connection. Isolation. Not just physical isolation, though that helps, but psychological isolation. The severing of bonds between individuals so they can no longer compare perceptions of reality. Hannah Arendt, who studied the rise of totalitarianism, identified this as essential. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. When you're isolated, you lose access to the reality checks that human connection provides. Think about it. When something strange happens, what's your first instinct? To ask someone else, "Did you see that? Is this normal? Am I crazy?" But when you're isolated, there's no one to ask. Your perception becomes a closed loop, and this isolation doesn't require physical distance. It can be achieved by turning people against each other. Divide and conquer. Make them distrust their neighbors. Label some groups as dangerous, contaminated, or morally inferior. Suddenly, the isolated individual has no one to trust except the very authorities creating the isolation. This is why every cult separates members from family and friends. This is why totalitarian regimes break up communities and encourage citizens to report on each other. A population that cannot communicate honestly cannot resist collectively. They've been atomized, reduced to isolated, terrified individuals, perfect targets for stage 4, the false savior. Now comes the pivot. After fear, confusion, and isolation have broken down the individual's defenses, stage 4 offers relief in the form of a false savior. This savior can be a person, a movement, an ideology, or even an institution. What matters is what it provides: certainty in a world of chaos, community in a landscape of isolation, and most importantly, an enemy. An enemy. The psychologist Carl Jung understood that humans in distress will project their shadow, their repressed fears and hatreds, onto an external target. The false savior provides that target. Everything wrong in your life, everything wrong in the world, suddenly has a face. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And once you've accepted the ideology, once you've identified the enemy, something remarkable happens. The fear transforms into purpose. The confusion transforms into clarity. The isolation transforms into belonging. You feel better. You feel righteous. You feel part of something larger than yourself. This is the seduction. The relief is real. The certainty feels genuine, but it's built on a foundation of delusion. Historical examples are endless: the scapegoating of Jews in Nazi Germany, landlords in Maoist China, intellectuals in Cambodia. Each time, a population in psychic distress was offered an enemy to blame and a savior to follow. And they accepted gratefully, because anything feels better than sustained terror and confusion. But stage 5 is where it gets truly horrifying. Willing executioners. Stage 5 is the transformation of victim into perpetrator. The individuals who went through stages 1 through 4, the fearful, confused, isolated believers, now become the most zealous enforcers of the delusion. They don't need to be commanded. They volunteer. The historian Daniel Goldhagen wrote about this phenomenon in his study of ordinary Germans during the Holocaust, calling them willing executioners. Not brainwashed automatons, but active participants who believed they were doing good. The ordinary men who became killers did so not because they were coerced, but because they believed. This is the most disturbing stage, because it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. Given the right conditions, ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty, and they do it with moral conviction. They report their neighbors. They enforce the ideology with more strictness than the authorities themselves. They attack anyone who questions the narrative, because questioning the narrative threatens their newfound certainty, community, and purpose. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo demonstrated this in his famous Stanford prison experiment. Ordinary college students, given arbitrary power and an ideology of authority, became abusive in less than a week. The mask transforms the person. We like to believe we'd be different, we'd resist, we'd see through the manipulation, but history suggests otherwise. Under the right conditions, fear, confusion, isolation, and the offer of belonging, most people comply, and many become enforcers. The question is, what makes someone resistant to this pattern? Historical patterns. Let's trace this pattern through history to see how consistent it is. The witch trials of the 1600. Stage 1. Fear of Satan and evil spreading through communities. Stage 2. Conflicting accusations and impossible tests. You drown if innocent, float if guilty. Stage 3. Isolation through suspicion. Anyone could be a witch, even your own family. Stage 4. The church as savior, providing the framework to identify and destroy evil. Stage 5. Ordinary townspeople becoming accusers, torturers, executioners. Same pattern, different century. Soviet Russia under Stalin. Stage 1. fear of counter-revolutionaries and capitalist infiltrators. Stage 2, party lines changing constantly, yesterday's hero becoming today's traitor. Stage 3, encouraged denunciation breaking family bonds and friendships. Stage 4, the Communist Party as savior of the working class. Stage 5, citizens reporting neighbors participating in show trials, staffing gulags. Nazi Germany, Maoist China, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Cultural Revolution. Each follows the same 5 stages with mechanical precision. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes with terrifying consistency. The names change, the enemies change, the ideology changes, but the psychological pattern remains identical because it exploits vulnerabilities hardwired into human cognition. This brings us to an uncomfortable question. The modern question: are we in a mass psychosis right now? I'm not going to tell you what to think. That would make me part of the problem. Instead, let's examine the conditions. Stage 1, fear. Has there been sustained, inescapable fear pushed through every medium? Fear about health, about the economy, about political opponents, about the very survival of democracy or society? You know the answer. Stage 2, confusion. Have you experienced contradictory information from authorities, changing guidelines, experts disagreeing fundamentally, the sense that you can't determine what's actually true anymore? Stage 3, isolation. Have communities been divided? Have you been encouraged to view certain groups as dangerous, ignorant, or morally inferior? Have family relationships been strained over ideological differences? It is difficult to free fools from the chains they revere. Stage 4, have false saviors emerged? Movements, leaders, or ideologies that offer certainty, identify enemies, and promise to restore order. Stage 5, have ordinary people become zealous enforcers of narratives, attacking those who question, demanding compliance, celebrating the punishment of dissenters? I'm not going to answer these questions for you, because if I did, I'd just be another voice telling you what to think, and you've had enough of that. What I will tell you is how to protect yourself. Psychological defense. The antidote to mass psychosis is psychological sovereignty, the ability to think independently even under pressure. Here's what that requires. First, manage your fear response. This doesn't mean ignoring real dangers. It means recognizing when fear is being deliberately amplified to bypass your rational mind. When you feel terror, pause. Ask, is this fear proportional to the actual threat? Who benefits from me being afraid? Fear is a tool. Second, embrace uncertainty. This is counterintuitive because uncertainty is uncomfortable. But the desperate need for certainty is exactly what makes you vulnerable to false saviors. The mature mind can say, I don't know, the evidence is unclear, I might be wrong. That humility is armor against manipulation. Third, maintain connections. Real connections with people who have different perspectives, not echo chambers where everyone agrees. The reality checks we get from honest disagreement are essential for psychological health. 1. Question your fear sources. 2. Embrace not knowing. 3. Seek diverse perspectives. 4. Examine your enemies. 5. Protect your attention. 4th, examine your enemies carefully. If you find yourself hating an entire group of people, if they seem purely evil with no redeeming qualities, that's a warning sign. That's how the shadow gets projected. Real humans are complex. Cartoon villains are manufactured. 5th, guard your attention ruthlessly. Mass psychosis is transmitted through media consumption. The constant stream of fear, outrage, and division is the vector. Control what enters your mind. The sane minority. Throughout history, even in the worst mass psychoses, some people remained sane. They saw through the manipulation. They refused to participate in the persecution. They maintained their humanity when everyone around them lost theirs. What made them different? Research on rescuers during the Holocaust, ordinary people who risked their lives to save Jews, reveals common traits. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. They had a strong internal locus of identity. Their sense of self wasn't dependent on group approval. They could tolerate social rejection for the sake of their values. They had previous exposure to diverse groups. They knew the scapegoated people as individuals, not abstractions. It's easy to dehumanize strangers. It's harder to dehumanize someone you've shared a meal with. They had a family history of independent thinking, parents who questioned authority, who valued moral reasoning over obedience. This was transmitted across generations. They acted early. Once you've participated in the persecution, even in small ways, it becomes psychologically difficult to reverse course. The sane minority said no at the beginning. You probably know right now what you believe is true and what you're just going along with. The question is whether you have the courage to act on that knowledge. The way forward. Mass psychosis is not inevitable. It requires conditions, and those conditions can be disrupted. Every individual who maintains psychological sovereignty weakens the system. Every honest conversation chips away at the isolation. Every refusal to hate the designated enemy breaks the spell a little more. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, understood that the human spirit can endure almost anything if it finds meaning. The meaning here is clear: to remain human when humanity seems to be collapsing around you. That is the work. Not to convert others, not to win arguments, not to be right, but to maintain your own sanity, your own compassion, your own capacity for nuanced thought, to see enemies as complex humans, to question your own certainties as rigorously as you question others, to connect with people across ideological divides, to feel fear without being ruled by it, to embrace uncertainty without collapsing into nihilism. The cure for mass psychosis is mass psychological maturity. That maturity is developed one individual at a time, and it starts with you, with the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about yourself, with the courage to think independently even when it's costly, with the humility to admit you might be wrong even about things you feel certain about. The pattern of mass psychosis has repeated throughout history, but so has the pattern of individuals who resist it. You've now seen the pattern. 5 stages that have repeated across centuries and civilizations: the flooding of fear, the destruction of shared reality, the isolation of individuals, the false savior with its convenient enemy, and the transformation of victims into willing executioners. And you've asked yourself whether we're in one now. I don't have that answer for you, but you do. Somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the propaganda from all sides, you know what feels true and what feels manufactured. You know which of your beliefs are genuinely yours and which were installed without your consent. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The 5 stages of mass psychosis exploit psychological vulnerabilities that exist in all of us. No one is immune, but awareness is the first defense. And you now have that awareness. See the pattern, break it. If you made it this far, comment pattern breaker if you're committed to maintaining your psychological sovereignty. Welcome to the Psyche Project. If this made you think differently about the world around you, share it with someone who needs to see the pattern. Subscribe for more explorations into the depths of the human psyche. Until next time, keep questioning.